Hey there, and welcome to this super quick tutorial on setting up EcsRx in a .NET console application. To start with, let's make a new console application. You can use any IDE you want. I'll be using JetBrains Rider here. Once we've made our console application, let's just run it to make sure it's all working before we start writing our own bits. Now, we need to quickly make a way to stop the application from turning off when our app started. None of this is EcsRx specific code, but it will allow us to run the application until we manually close it. Now we need to go get the EcsRx NuGet files. There's quite a few there, but we only really need the EcsRx infrastructure and the EcsRx infrastructure inject, which provides us with a dependency injection provider. You can use whichever one you want, but we'll be using this for the sake of simplicity in this tutorial. It's worth noting you don't need to use the infrastructure library, but it makes things a lot simpler because it comes out the box with common patterns and paradigms to make everything easier to set up and run. So let's jump into making the application, which is just an entry point really for our EcsRx logic. We'll call this my EcsRx application, and inherits from the EcsRx application abstract class, which under the hood implements an application interface, but you don't really need to worry about any of that stuff right now. As you can see, we only have a few bits we need to implement. There's our application started entry point for our logic, as well as the container, which is our dependency injection provider. We won't worry too much about that. Internally, EcsRx supports the notion of DI, but it has an abstraction layer, so it doesn't care too much about which DI provider you're using. Once that's sorted, we need to get the default entity collection, which provides us a way to interact with entities, and we can use methods such as create entity, remove entity, etc. Then we can start populating components on there. So let's give it a console component, and then we'll start filling in the gaps in a sec. In case you're not aware of the ECS paradigm, a component is just a data container object. It doesn't have any logic. An ECS has an iComponent interface, which signifies that a class or a struct should be treated as a component. In this case, we're also going to be using an extension method, just because there's a lot of extension methods to make things simpler. The component itself will just contain an integer field for time alive, but you can put whatever you want in your own components, and the convention is that components live within a component's namespace. However, you can just put them wherever you want, really. But for now, let's just keep to that convention, and let's move this component into a component namespace. It is worth mentioning here that the application has quite a lot of lifecycle steps. We don't need to worry about them for the moment, but in more advanced scenarios, you'll be wanting to add to certain parts such as loading plugins and when your application's stopped, etc. So it's worth knowing that they're there. So the next thing to think about is systems. Now systems do the actual logic in the ECS world, and the convention is that systems should live within a system's namespace. This allows them to be automatically resolved by the DI provider, however you can manually put them wherever you want and manually bind them yourself. So let's go ahead and make our elapsed time system here. Now there's a bit to take in. So we have a group, and a group specifies what components a system should use. So in this case, we want the system to listen to all console components, which is what we made before. Then we want to basically give it some logic and say, right, okay, when we get the entity, we want to get the console component off there, and then we want to update the time alive on there, the elapsed seconds that have happened. But to do that, we need some way of finding out how much time's elapsed, and luckily there's a built-in iUpdateScheduler object, which again, because everything is hooked together via dependency injection in the infrastructure layer, we can just inject that in via the constructor, and we'll get that for free. So every time that this system processes the entity, it can basically say how much time has passed, add that to the time alive. And I forgot to mention that we also have to implement the iBasic entity system. There's plenty of other interfaces for different conventions of system, and you can find out more about that in the documentation. But basically this one says, I will process each entity every update. And for most use cases, it'll either be iBasic system or iBasic entity system. So much like the other system, let's make a new system now, which is the console output system. And this one's job is to get the console components of all the entities that it cares about, and then spit them out into the console. And you may be wondering, why don't we have all this logic in one system? And you could do that, but generally you should try and aim to have your systems be as atomic and encapsulated as possible. So they just do one thing, and they do it very well on a specific subset of data. Now we've done the hard bit, let's actually use our application. So let's go back to the program, and we'll put in there, application equals a new my EcsRx application, and we'll start the application, We'll keep the time alive there, so obviously the application doesn't close on us, and then we'll stop the application afterwards. And if we run that, as you can see, it's just printing out all the time alive data every time that it updates. And while it's not that complex, it shows the basics to get you started in ECS. Now let's do something more advanced. Let's go back to our system in the elapsed time system, and if the elapsed time has gone over, let's say 2 seconds, we want to delete the component from the entity. So basically it should output up to about 2 seconds, and then it should just stop. And then if we run that now, as we can see, the console logs stop after about 2000. So the application is still running, and the system is too, but because there's no longer entities with the console component on there, no output's being generated. So as you can see, the systems, they will take the entity, and in real time, if components are removed, those systems react to that. I hope that was useful, and if you have any more questions, drop by the EcsRx Discord. We're always happy to chat and help people on there. Thanks a lot, bye bye.